Well, I want to take a moment just to say good morning to those who might be watching online later on today. I usually try to get these videos up on Sunday afternoon. So I know we do have quite a few people that watch it, and every once in a while I just get surprised by somebody I don't even know. So that's a blessing. Just to know that our ministry goes beyond our doors and beyond the walls of this building. And we never know how God is going to use us down in the future. One day we just might have a bunch of people show up that we have no idea who they are because they saw us online. So God is using this challenging circumstance and time to do things that we can't even imagine right now. So, and hopefully part of that might be those who have been watching us online. This morning when I got up, like some of you maybe, I took a look at my Facebook page for a few minutes to just kind of catch up on any news or kind of see any thoughts that some friends might be feeling worthy to share. And one friend posted a quote this morning that said, "When you can't control what's happening, challenge yourself to control the way you respond to what is happening." And that's been the thrust of our series that we've been in the past few weeks, as we've talked about choosing how we respond to the circumstances that we've dealt with for the last 8 or 9 months and into 2021, and how we respond to challenges that we may encounter, any time in our life, but particularly at the time that we're dealing with right now. And we've talked about choosing to face them with courage instead of fear, choosing to let our perspective come from a deep well of joy that is available to us as followers of Jesus, instead of wallowing in anxiety and self-pity and so forth. And reminding ourselves that sometimes our circumstances are perfect opportunities to choose love over indifference and self-preservation. Now, last week we began a conversation about how worship plays a critical part in this process and plays a critical part in how we respond to the things that we can't control. But to emphasize the fact that the primary purpose of worship is for God's glory and not for our own, I broke up the subject into 2 parts. I didn't have that intention in the beginning, but the more I was working on the message, the more I realized we need to just take a week just to focus on the real purpose of our worship, which is what we did last week. And in that part, we drew from King David's writing of Psalm chapter 71, a working concept of worship, as we looked at some of the many expressions in the way David did worship. At the first part of our 2-part big idea, we said that worship is any spirit-to-spirit expression in which we acknowledge and celebrate the attributes, the activities, and the abundances of God simply because He is worthy of it. And when I say spirit to spirit, of course, that's little s spirit to capital S spirit. From our spirit to His spirit. Any expression which we acknowledge and celebrate the attributes, the activities, and the abundances of God simply because He is worthy of it. Now, David, in that particular chapter, mentioned and personally participated in several different expressions of worship. In addition to the obvious activities such as singing and playing music, simply giving a testimony of God's activity in our life, or writing thoughts of praise or adoration in a journal, or even taking and sharing beautiful pictures of nature in which we are giving credit to God, are all different expressions of worship. Taking communion, giving, all that is expressions of worship. And although some of those can and should be very personal between you and God, worship is best when it is shared with a community of believers, of like-minded followers of Jesus, because then not only is God getting the praise, but others who may be in desperate need of it at that time are reminded of His goodness at maybe just the proper moment in their particular situation. And that thought leads us into the second part of our conversation on worship today, and to the second part of this 2-part big idea, which is this. This is the second part of that. In His mercy, God uses our sincerely motivated worship as an opportunity to realign our human frailties with His divine provision. Now, there might be a better way to say that. That's just the best way I could come up with. But the idea is that in all the places where our human capacities and weaknesses are exposed, He fills in the gaps when we worship. Last week I used the silly example of the comic book character Superman, who flies toward the sun to replenish his energies and his strength, as an example of what worship to God is like. The more we worship, the closer we go out to God, and the more He replenishes our strength. Here's maybe another way to describe the overall result of a true worship experience. When we enter into a worship with a little s spirit to capital S spirit intention, we inevitably walk away with a capital S spirit to a little s spirit outcome. When we enter into worship with a spirit-to-spirit intention, we inevitably walk away with a spirit to spirit outcome. One man wrote that worship is the first and foremost for God's benefit, not ours. Though it is marvelous to discover that in giving him pleasure, we ourselves enter into what can become our richest and most wholesome experience in life. Now, as I mentioned last week, nobody seemed to have a better handle on the value, the necessity, and the personal benefits of worship than David did, King David. And in many ways, very few people had the limit of their personal capacities exposed like he did. He was often at death's door, whether it be in a battle challenged by a 9-foot bully or chased by a jealous king who was trying to keep David from becoming king, or whether he was on the run from his power-hungry son named Abimelech. In fact, the passage we're going to be feeding off of today was written during the time that he was on that run from his son. When David screwed up, he screwed up big. When he got angry, he let it consume him at times. He experienced ultimate betrayal by those under his authority and in his own family. And the list goes on. But no matter his fears or his frailties or his faults or his failures, no matter how out of alignment he was with God or felt with God, he constantly went back to worship to get centered and focused again. So it seemed appropriate that once again, we will take our cue from David this morning. And with that, I want to turn our attention to Psalm chapter 34. Psalm chapter 34, where David will once again draw us into one of his own worship experiences, sharing with us all that he personally gained from worship. And then he encourages us to do the same. I'm just going to be looking at the first 10 verses of that. Here's what it says. I will praise the Lord at all times. I will constantly speak his praises. I will boast only in the Lord. This is this worship experience he's drawing us to. Let all who are helpless take heart. Come, let us tell of the Lord's greatness. Let us exalt his name together. I prayed to the Lord, and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Those who look to him for help will be radiant with joy. No shadow of shame will darken their faces. In my desperation I prayed, and the Lord listened. He saved me from all my troubles. For the angel of the Lord is a guard. He surrounds and he defends all who fear him. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, the joys of those who take refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his godly people, for those who fear him will have all that they need. Even strong young lions sometimes go hungry, but those who trust in the Lord will lack no good thing. Isn't that beautiful? What David asserts here is that when we worship, we rediscover the faith that we can have in the one who can overcome our fear and our frailty. We rediscover the grace of the one who can remove our sadness and our shame, and we rediscover the dependency that we can have on him to rescue us from drowning in our troubles. And as I reflected on this passage, 3 specific ways in which God uses our worship to realign us kind of stood out to me. First, worship reminds us that there is a healthy fear that overpowers the unhealthy fear that can easily consume us. As I thought about this truth, several examples came to mind. The first one is the story from when God called Moses to be his leader in rescuing the nation of Israel out from Egypt. Remember this story? In Exodus chapter 3 and 4. Moses' answers to God give it a very effective picture of what fear can do to us. For example, Moses' interaction with God reminds us that our fear can easily expose our insecurity, especially when we're being challenged to do something far bigger than we ever imagined we could do. Moses didn't see himself as any type of leader, or at least not any time recently. The last time he was in any position of authority as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he killed a slave master who abused one of his fellow Israelites. And that resulted in him ending up on the wrong side of the law. He ran so far, so fast that nobody would find him. Now God is asking him to go back to that very place. I'd feel a little bit afraid too, wouldn't you? Of course, he eventually told him that all the people who wanted him dead were gone, but he didn't tell him that at first. Moses also felt limited by his own inadequacy, as some of us may feel at times. In his conversation with God, he suddenly remembered he had this subpar communication ability. Right? Maybe it was something he was made fun of as a kid, and it deeply wounded his self-confidence. We don't know. Fear has a way, though, of reminding us of old demons like that. Now that he's being asked to speak on God's behalf, he's afraid. Understandably so, if he truly had public speaking issues. Finally, Moses just said, I don't want to go. He just comes out flat out and says it. He didn't know what to expect, and in every scenario he played out in his mind, this was not going to end well for him. But God would have none of it. God emphatically says, enough. When God tells you enough, that pretty much stops the conversation, doesn't it? Moses soon realizes that a fear of God was more powerful than anything he could be afraid of in Pharaoh's court. But the fascinating thing from this whole encounter, I believe, was in God's answers to Moses. Every time Moses comes up with an I can't, God came back with an I will. And that's what worship does to us. It turns our attention from hearing ourselves say sheepishly, I can't, to hearing God say emphatically, I will. Another scene in which the fear of God overtakes the fear of extenuating circumstances comes from the story recorded in Mark chapter 4. In this scene, Jesus and his team of students hop on a boat to cross the Sea of Galilee, like they probably had done several other times. And as they're rowing, one of the infamous sudden storms that the Sea of Galilee is still well known for today came upon them. The winds and the waves proved to be too much for their experienced seaworthy skills. You can almost hear the anguish in their voices as they scream out for life. But they forgot who was in the boat with them. And for good reason. Who could blame them? Jesus was fast asleep over somewhere in the corner of the boat. Now, having been in a cruise ship going through seasickness, I don't see how he could even sleep through that. That's beyond me. Nevertheless, they wake him up. They question his concern for the matter at hand and for their own lives. And upon getting up, he speaks first to the wind and the waves 2 words, be still. And immediately the storm stops. Then he questions their fears and their faith. But in that moment, their unhealthy fear of the storm is replaced with a very healthy fear of the one who's put the storm to sleep in 2 words. The very last verse of chapter 4 speaks of this moment of clarity that the disciples had toward Jesus. And it reads this, and they were now filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obeyed him? Their unhealthy fear gave way to a greater fear of the one who's calmed the sea and the storm. When we talk about a healthy fear of God, we're not talking about a fear of his reprimand or his reprisal or his wrath, although those can certainly be good motivators. But to fear God in the way Scripture often refers to it is just to have mad respect for, to be in awe of, to be in complete awareness of his sovereign control and his power over any given circumstance, any given element, at any given time. That awareness can't help but move us to a moment of worship. But in the moments that we do forget, true worship revitalizes that awareness. And according to David's testimony in Psalm 34, the more we sing about it, the more we testify to it, the more we express adoration in any way, then the more the fear of God will eclipse the fear of our circumstances. And the second thing I kind of took away from this Psalm 34 text is that in our worship, God unleashes the grace that drives away from us the shadow of shame that often hangs over us. David knew all about this shadow of shame. In the moment of his deepest sorrow and remorse, after the prophet Nathan put his sin in perspective for him, David writes this in Psalm 51, verse 3. He says, I know my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. His sin haunts him. That shadow of shame hung over him. Have you ever known that shadow in your life? Years later, in a place called Samaria, a woman who was all too familiar with that shadow avoided going to the well to draw water at the same time as the rest of the women in her neighborhood, because she knew that she was the talk of the town. Being cast as a society stereotype had the way of escalating our shame that we might feel internally. Regardless if they were her fault or not, she'd been married 5 times and was living with a man she wasn't married to. She felt the heaviness of that shadow. That dark shadow of shame hung over a guy named Peter, who denied even knowing his best friend. The guy who saved him in the middle of that huge storm. The guy who enabled him to walk on water and then kept him from drowning when he got scared. He had promised just a few hours before that he would die before he ever let anything happen to him. But after denying knowing him, he was consumed with shame when Jesus died. It just swallowed him whole. Perhaps the only one who felt that shadow even more than Peter was a friend of his named Judas, known as Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus into the hands of those who sought and fought for his crucifixion. It was not how Judas saw this scene playing out in his head. I don't think that was really his intention. But instead of doing what David did and going back to worship, or what the woman from Samaria and Peter did by engaging in conversation with Jesus, Judas let his shame get the best of him and, of course, took his own life. Would God's grace have been great enough to cover Judas, the one who had betrayed Jesus, had he sought realignment through worship instead of resigning to a rope and a tree? Honestly, I have no doubt that God's grace would have covered even Judas. It's not easy to worship when you're consumed by guilt and shame. You feel embarrassed, you feel hypocritical, and you're convinced that God wouldn't give us 2 seconds of his time to listen when you know you screwed up again and again, or even greater than ever before. And yet, it is in that moment that God meets our shame, not with his wrath, but with his grace. Grace not to affirm or to give permissiveness to our bad choices, but to realign us to His will and His path. David and Peter and the woman from Samaria and millions of others testify to this truth. You can testify to this truth in your own life. The third thing I pull from Psalm 34 passage is that worship moves us from the unsettling feeling of desperation to a very resolved sense of dependency on God. I'm thinking about a woman who had seen a doctor after doctor after doctor for a dozen years because of a perpetual bleeding issue. Aside from the obvious discomfort and the costly inconvenience of her problem, it also consigned her to a life of loneliness as a social outcast due to the religious implications and the social stigma associated with bleeding in that culture. Desperation described the man who stood at the base of a mountain while three of Jesus' followers were watching Jesus be unveiled in His heavenly form when talking with Moses and Elijah. This man at the base of the mountain was the father of a young boy who he had spent years watching a demon just ravage and rob his son of a voice, throwing him into fire, then even attempting to drown him on a few occasions. His desperation reached a boiling point when the other 9 disciples turned out to be no match for the evil spirit inside of his son, and it drained the father to his very last ounce of faith. Have you been there? Fear, shame, and desperation are overwhelming. Maybe those things have even led you to a place of great bitterness at times. Another contributor to the book of Psalms could relate to that. He had become disillusioned, seeing wicked and greedy people continually to get richer and more powerful. He became envious and bitter. He couldn't understand why. Finally, in spite of this disillusionment and bitterness, he chose to worship. In Psalm 73, he testified that he went to the sanctuary and he began to see the complete, bigger picture. And when he wrote his testimony about coming to a point of worship in these words. Here's what he writes. Then I realized that my heart was bitter, and I was all torn up inside. I was foolish and ignorant. I must have seemed like a senseless animal to you. Yet I still belong to you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, leading me to a glorious destiny. Whom have I in heaven but you? I desire you more than anything on earth. My health may fail, and my spirit may grow weak, but God remains the strength of my heart. He is mine forever. So when worship becomes our default response to fear, to shame, to desperation, to disillusionment, to bitterness, and all those other things, in those moments we will find the joy and the rest and the peace often not seen in the most helpless situations by others. Like 2 guys named Paul and Silas did, who found themselves in a dirty dungeon at midnight in a little town called Philippi. And in spite of their fear or desperation that they may have experienced, that many of us would feel in those circumstances, they showed no signs of either. The rest of the prisoners were looking on in shock, and they listened to these guys worship, singing songs and praying and giving glory to God. And their response and their testimony changed forever a prison guard's life and helped begin a church in that small town. Like these guys, when David got impatient, he worshiped. When he got angry and bitter and even on the borderline of hate, he worshiped. When he recognized that he was overcome by his own sins, he worshiped. When he was anxious and he felt overwhelmed by desperation, he worshiped. And when things were going great and he felt fulfilled and blessed, he worshiped. When he knew the temptations and the trap of pride, he worshiped. And here's something else to remember, and we kind of touched on this last week. When David worshiped, he was authentic about his feelings. Some of the Psalms can make you cringe, you know? I mean, they would have easily put him in Facebook jail or got kicked off of social media today. But in his worship, he was authentic, knowing that nothing, not even the deepest thought in the crevice of his heart, could be hidden from God. J.I. Packer wrote that there is a great incentive to worship and to love God in the thought that, for some unfathomable reason, He wants me as His friend, and He desires to be my friend. And He's given His Son to die for me in order to realize this purpose. Not merely that we know God, but that He knows us. In worship, He meets our secret thoughts with His mercy. He meets our pride with His presence. He meets our gratitude with more blessings. He meets our fear with His authority. He meets our inadequacy with His sufficiency. He meets our sorrow with His joy. He meets our feelings of shame and unworthiness with His nail-scarred hands, which scream out the proclamation that we are worthy enough to die for. And when we come to worship, we take time to ask the question, in what area of frailty has God met you? Or is He currently meeting you? How has His strength and provision lifted you up? In what way is He being active, or was He active? What inadequacy have you brought to Him, or do you need to bring Him? What weakness, so that He can fill it with His strength? In seeking answers to these questions and searching for strength in feeble times, we discover that there is nothing more necessary for us than to do in this world than to worship. Not just for expressing God's greatness, but also to allow His strength to cover our weakness, to remind us that we are not alone in this journey, that we were worthy to die for. To paraphrase something someone else wrote, people who don't worship are soon swept into a vast restlessness, which is already an epidemic in this world. Without worship, we have no steady direction and no sustaining purpose. Worship is first and foremost for God's glory and benefit, not our own. But worship transforms us. It keeps us in the ongoing presence of God. Worship is the path to a conscious clearing, courage-creating, countenance-changing experience. In the very last verse of Psalm 73 that I just read a minute ago, the author records its final conclusion saying this, "But as for me, how good it is to be near God. I have made the sovereign Lord my shelter, and I will tell everyone about the wonderful things you do." In other words, even in the most fearful, shameful, discouraging, and desperate of times, he says, I will choose worship. Let's pray.